Wars have been fought in the Buddha's name, and even Buddhist meditation and monastic discipline have been adapted to train armies, to defend national interests, and to conquer neighboring peoples. Let me offer a couple of examples. In the Mahavamsa, or Great Chronicle of Sri Lanka, King Duttagamani, who reigned in the 1st and 2nd century Common Era, experienced deep remorse after his bloody defeat of the Hindu Tamils. But unlike his Indian predecessor, Ashoka, Duttagamani fought not only to unify the island kingdom, but also to defend the Buddhist way of life. His enemies were not only armed aliens with ties to the mainland, they were Hindus, the worshippers of alien gods. And unlike Ashoka, the Sinhalese king was comforted by 8 Buddhist monks who assured him that in spite of the thousands slain in the battle, only 1.5 humans perished. One who had pledged allegiance to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the 3 refuges, and another who had vowed to follow the Buddhist precepts. All the other Hindu Tamils were unbelievers and men of evil life, subhuman and deserving of death. In the book Buddhism, Imperialism, and War, 1979, Trevor Ling writes, Buddhism in Southeast Asia has been successfully employed to reinforce the policies and interests of national rulers, often in their competition with one another for resources and prestige. The author chronicles the history of military violence between the Buddhist states of Thailand and Burma, as well as the efforts of civil and clerical officials to formulate the notion of Buddhist holy warfare. A dramatic example was the speech delivered by the Thai Buddhist patriarch, the highest-ranking monk, on the occasion of the coronation of King Rama VI in the year 1910. The patriarch praised the new king for steps he had taken to prepare for war in times of peace, strengthening the army and navy, founding the Corps of Wild Tigers, the elite tactical force, and starting the Boy Scout movement to foster in boys the warrior spirit. Another example is the support of Buddhist leaders and institutions for Japan's military excursions in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 5 and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 5. For the rise of militantly nationalistic imperial way Buddhism during the years 1913 to 30, and particularly during the Pacific War against Japan's East Asian neighbors and the United States during World War II. In a sobering study, Zen at War, Brian Victoria shows how the major Japanese Buddhist lineages lined up to demonstrate lockstep patriotism in the decades between the ascendancy of Emperor Meiji in 1868 and the outbreak of World War II. Buddhist clergy and intellectuals aligned their spiritual tradition with the medieval way of the warrior, Bushido, and with the prowess of the Japanese war machine. The best-known Buddhist missionary in the West, D.T. Suzuki, in his first English-language publication on Zen Buddhism for the Journal of the Polytext Society, wrote, "The calmness, even the joyfulness of heart in the moment of death, which is conspicuously observable in the Japanese, the intrepidity which is generally shown by the Japanese soldiers in the face of an overwhelming enemy, and the fairness of play to the opponent so strongly taught in Bushido, all these come from the spirit of Zen training, not from any such blind fatalistic conception as is sometimes thought to be the trait peculiar to Orientals." By the war's end, Zen temples were sponsoring meditation training camps for the armed forces, raising money for the purchase of new aircraft, and recruiting middle school boys to fly kamikaze missions for the love of the emperor and in service to the Buddha. Alluding to a famous metaphor in Zen training, Victoria concludes that for these boys in search of adventure and sacrifice, quote, "truly may it be said that their lives were now as light as goose feathers." So these and some other examples are offered in a chapter in a book called Subverting Hatred, which was published 20 years ago, for which I contributed the chapter on Buddhism, Peace Teachings, which is kind of a comprehensive survey of Buddhist peace teachings, but also shortcomings in this field. So finally, we should mention the current violence against the Muslim Rohingya minority in Myanmar and Thailand by the Buddhist majority. In a disturbing feature story last July titled "The Face of Buddhist Terror," Time magazine profiled a popular Buddhist monk who has come to be called the Burmese bin Laden. The Venerable Wiratu, who was jailed for 7 years for inciting pogroms against Muslims, is now back, calling on Buddhists to shun people of other faiths, a duty more important than democracy. Now, nowhere in this article is Aung San Suu Kyi mentioned for speaking out against this rising tide of racial violence, though surely she is working behind the scenes to oppose these forces. She's in a very delicate situation vis-a-vis the new government and these uprisings, as you can imagine. It may seem odd to introduce our speaker tonight on the topic Buddhist peacemaking in war-torn lands by recounting these dark chapters in Buddhist history. But I've known our speaker for many years and am confident that Paula will help us understand that Buddhism has far more to offer in the peacemaking side than on the side of demagoguery and violence. Without the Dharma, her many achievements in the field of practice and the field of peacemaking studies would not have been possible. So I asked Paula to send me her CV, and she did very nicely. It's many, many pages, but I just want to hit on a couple of the high points. She is professor of peace building and conflict transformation. Now that in itself, I think, is a great tribute that a person would have that title at an Institute of Higher Learning, professor of peace building and conflict transformation, the School of International Training Graduate Institute in Brattleboro, Vermont, since 1995. She's the founder director of the Conflict Transformation Across Cultures, or CONTACT, which offers programs for interns who are leaders, local leaders from all over the world in peace-building strategies. She's a senior fellow and founder director of the Karuna Center for Peacebuilding, Partners in Dialogue, Conflict Transformation, and Reconciliation, founded back in 1994. She has been recognized in the past 3 years for her amazing interventions around the world with an award, Psychology of Peace and Justice Prize from the Psychologist for Social Responsibility in 2012, Leadership and Service as a Peacemaker, an award from the Symposium of Engaged Buddhism in 2012, which I helped to organize with Roshi Bernie Glassman, and finally the Unsung Hero of Compassion Award from His Holiness the Dalai Lama in April 2009. She's been guest lecturer at 20, 30 universities, and I won't mention them all, but there are many great universities on the list. And I think the fact that the Ho Foundation immediately jumped at the opportunity to help us to meet with her tonight is an example of her international reputation. There's an interesting section in her CV about international consultations, training, and education, which is by continent. And it's all the countries within each continent that she has visited to help people to sit down and start listening to one another. So just as an example, in Africa. What?
Isn't everybody CV like this?
No, this is totally, this is over the top, Paula. So Ethiopia, Uganda, 5 Rwandas. She's been to Rwanda 4 or 5 times, where she was incarcerated in a former nunnery. Didn't know whether she would come out alive. South Africa, of course, Tanzania and Uganda, Zaire and Zambia. Afghanistan, Burma, India, and any country where there has been conflict over the past 50 years, Paula has been there at one point or another. And in the car, we were talking about hair-raising experiences that we've had. I hope she'll share a few of those stories with us tonight. Publications including manuals for activists, Engaged Buddhism, a manual for social change, which she authored with Stephanie Kaza, who teaches environmental studies at University of Vermont, is a close friend. Many, many more books, many articles and chapters and so forth. I would like to, I meant to pull these out. In my class, we are reading Engaged Buddhism in the West, which I edited some time ago. And within that book, there is a chapter by Paula called Walking for Peace, which details the way in which she invited and helped to introduce the Nipponzan Myohoji peace monks to the small hill towns of western Massachusetts, who were frankly terrified that these cultists would come in and eat their children for breakfast or something, rather than building one of the most beautiful Buddhist peace monuments in North America, the New England Peace Pagoda in Leverett, Mass., which is where Paula lives. And her stories about how those monks slept in her home while the meetings, the very hair-raising meetings were going on in town to permit them to buy the property and to develop the pagoda, is profiled in the chapter Walking for Peace in this book. And there's a profile of Paula herself in the chapter by Susan Moon on activist Buddhist women. So you can read about Paula and share Paula's insights by looking into our textbook in the course. I think you better start. So Paula Green, it's such a pleasure to be with you and to introduce you to this Harvard audience, and we are completely at your disposal for the next hour and a half.
Thank you for being here, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you, and I want to talk a little bit about my background. This is going to be a very different kind of an event. This is going to be a full participation lecture. I don't use the lecture method very much overseas or with my own students, and we'll be engaged together as my work is engaged Buddhist work around the world. So I'll be asking you questions, you'll be talking to people sitting next to you, and we'll be having our own kind of seminar this evening. I'm a psychologist by training, and I've had kind of twin rivers in my life of interest in mental health and the way of the mind and the way of emotions, and other very strong underpinning in social activism and in a commitment to nonviolence. And as many of you who were starting your careers are finding out, you tend to weave your life in ways that are pretty unpredictable, but that bring in the different values and different interests that may guide you. So my life has been a melding of looking at intergroup relations. I got a master's in intergroup relations before my doctorate in psychology, looking at the ways people work together, collaborate together, live together in community, and the ways in which they destroy each other. And then my work now, much of it is to help people rebuild after the violence that's destroyed their lives and their communities. And when I stopped being a professional psychologist and psychotherapist and professor of psychology about 25 years ago and moved into this new field of peace building, I found that everything I had ever learned as a psychologist I needed in doing international peace work. That the principles of human relationships and human suffering were very similar. So that blended quite well for me. My Dharma practice has mostly been at the Insight Meditation Society in Barrie, Vipassana meditation. And I took that up as I was exploring psychology, and actually wrote my doctorate on the relationship between humanistic psychotherapy and Dharma practice, trying to understand how each contributed to wholeness and transformation, and what the similarities and differences were. And so I found myself a bridge builder between those two disciplines. And now I find myself again as a bridge builder, looking at the relationship between Buddhist teaching, Buddhist values, Buddhist expressions, and the international world of peacemaking. I started my organization Karuna Center 20 years ago in 1994, and I chose the word karuna, or compassion, because at that time I was working pretty exclusively in Asia, and I thought that would continue. And then we got calls from the Israelis and Palestinians and the Rwandans and the Bosnians and other people, and I thought, well, it's a pretty Buddhist name for these countries. No one can pronounce it. They don't know what it means, but we kept it because compassion is the root of the work that we're doing. And so Karuna Center for Peace Building works in both Buddhist and non-Buddhist contexts. And I'll be talking to you tonight and showing you photos of many of the places in the world that I've worked, and we'll be thinking a lot about what Buddhism has to say and what Buddhist principles I have found most valuable in this work of social engagement. If you could imagine a braid of political, economic, and social peace building, which I think are the three main different kinds of peace building that people do, the braid is interwoven for it to hold, but the work that I focus on is mostly social peace building. It's mostly working in divided societies and helping people to rebuild after mass conflict, which is an extraordinarily difficult task, because in many places the people I work with on this side of the room have had their families killed by the people on this side of the room, and vice versa. And trying to pull something together again so that people feel that they can live safely is a huge challenge for them. And we do it because there's no place to go. There's no other countries that people can move to after mass violence, and they either repeat the cycles of violence, which is one of the grave dangers, that the counter-violence keeps happening, or they find ways to build enough bridges and find enough commonality to live together. I chose this for my opening slide because although this has nothing to do with Buddhism, this is a Hindu Indian Nobel Prize winner in economics. What he's talking about, the sharp divisions between people and the need to overcome those sharp divisions, is very much what my work is about. And Dharma has a lot to teach us, because one of the fundamental teachings in the Dharma is the delusion of separateness. That if we really understood deeply, we would see the interconnection and the interdependence. But in our ignorance, in our delusive thinking, we believe in our separateness and the reification of that separateness about identity, which I'll be talking about as well. Buddhist teaching, it seems to me, focuses largely on self-development. It doesn't have nearly as much to say about social structures, and very little to say about intergroup relationships. But those of us who work in this field of peace building, we understand that many of the causes of violent conflict have to do with unmet competing needs, that if people's basic human needs are not met, they will fight, because that's survival instinct. And I'll show you a diagram in a little while about those needs. And if their relationships are not satisfied, they will do what they have to do to satisfy them. If people are oppressed, if people are marginalized, if people are isolated, they will fight for their right in. So it's a very different understanding than what the Buddha was talking about. A colleague of mine just did a survey in Burma, or Myanmar. I still say Burma because the democracy movement has never accepted Myanmar. It was put out by the military government, and the people haven't spoken on behalf of Myanmar. They call themselves still Burma, so I still use the word Burma, along with the BBC, but the New York Times is using Myanmar. Anyway, this friend did a survey, and what he discovered was that when you ask the Buddhists in Burma how they think the situation in their country can be solved, they talk about personal virtuous qualities. They don't talk about any kind of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They don't talk about developing just social structures. They talk about the practice of compassion, loving kindness, generosity, and virtuous, and various kinds of virtuousness. And that makes a big difference. They feel that the inner attributes of anger and greed, if worked on alone, will be enough to change society. And I believe that if all of us really practiced those virtues, we wouldn't have any conflict in our society. If we really understood how to manage the toxins of greed, anger, and delusion, if we really understood interdependence, we wouldn't have violent conflict. But we don't understand those things, we don't absorb them enough, and most Buddhists don't either, as Chris was talking about, the conflict going on in Buddhist countries. So what we're trying to do is to take these spiritual virtues of kindness, equanimity, and compassion to the practical tasks of dealing with social and structural injustice and inequities in society that need to be remedied, and trying to put those together. So I want to talk about some of the great challenges that are facing the world right now and the ways in which the work of peace building tries to address some of those challenges. And I'd like you on a piece of scrap paper or someplace to write down, if you would, 3 to 5, just some small number of what you consider to be the most difficult challenges facing us in the world right now. So just take a few minutes and write those down. And what I'd like you to do is to just keep those in mind as we go through the evening talking about peace building and see if you can discern how the challenges you have listed are showing up in the global programs that I'm working on. I want to take us first to a fantastic new index that I suggest you all spend some time on sometime, thevisionofhumanity.org. It's a really remarkable global peace index. It was created about 2 or 3 years ago and ranks the countries of the world from the most peaceful to the least peaceful. This year there are 162 countries listed. Every year they add more countries. There's about 190 countries in the UN. The ones that are very tiny, they're not like the Caribbean islands and other very tiny places, are not in here, but anything with a population of more than 1 million or some such is listed. So almost all the countries of the world are listed. They've got a very interesting matrix. It's computer-fed matrix. There are 24 indexes. 12 are domestic, 12 are international. Every country is ranked, studied and ranked on those 24 different measures. It's all fed into the computer and tabulated, and you get results like this. Let me tell you something of the measures they use to help you understand this. The domestic measures include prison population, arms manufacturing, acceptance of refugees, political terror, perceived criminality in society, access to weapons, violent responses to demonstrations, and military expenditures. Makes you understand why the U.S. doesn't do very well, because many of those are issues in our own country. The international measures include UN peacekeeping cooperation, wars abroad, unwanted interventions in other countries, weapons exports, weapons imports, deaths from external conflicts, bases overseas. Again, you can see that the U.S. would not rank very highly on this. Putting all that through the computer, this is this year's list of the 10 most peaceful countries. It varies slightly year by year, but not drastically. The same kinds of countries compete. What do you notice when you look at that list? I work in some of those countries and in many others that are really struggling and have very little peace. And this dichotomy in the world is I think, one of the world's most difficult issues. There is now, if you go on this website, they've just developed a U.S. peace index. New England does very well. You'll be happy to know that where you are is the most successful region of the country. But given our issues of poverty, imprisonment, oppression, etc., we're not doing as well as we ought to be doing either. But and they're starting one now for the UK, also a regional one. So it's very interesting. When I show this to students, they want to see where they are, and they're never happy. Because if they're coming from Nepal or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Rwanda or other places in the world that I work, Bosnia, they want their number to be higher. But this is not a biased survey. It's computer generated, and it's pretty interesting. And the website has many more aspects to look at, so I recommend it to you. Another of the global challenges that I think is toxic for us is the world military spending. Look at that bite of the United States. $1.7 trillion annually. So what do you observe about that, and what are the implications? Not only that, but they're supposed to have a peace constitution.
They're about to change that, I think.
Their peace constitution is being pushed out by the current premier, very sadly. Yeah. Go ahead.
So 15 countries account for 80%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, the U.S. is supposed to be building its weapons in order to fight so-called enemies, and the enemies can't possibly compete with it. It's so lopsided. Chris?
This isn't a question, a trick question at all. It's a very open-ended question, but isn't it true that many of our so-called allies are very happy for us to spend all that money to help protect them? And it's not that they are colonies of the U.S., although one might argue that they are and they don't realize it. But in fact, they're more than happy. Japan might be an example of that, that we spend all this money to help provide some protection for them.
I've heard that argument. I think we'd have to ask Europeans themselves if they actually feel that way. I've heard it said. I don't know if it's a rationalization by Americans or if it's actually true for Europeans. I don't know how to answer that. Any Europeans here who could answer that? Oh, we've got several Europeans. What are your opinions? Any opinions? So differences between policymakers and the way people feel, which of course is true here as well, that we don't feel the way policymakers would necessarily feel. So this goes back to the question that Chris asked earlier. How do Buddhist countries measure up in war and peace? What would your guess be? How do you think Buddhist countries measure up in terms of war and peace issues? Go ahead. Not so well. Not so well. Let's take a look at some of the Buddhist countries that I've worked in and how they might measure up. There's Burma, the good and the bad, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the war that was mostly Buddhists against Buddhists. The Burmans, the majority group, which is about 70% of the country, has been waging war against the ethnic people since independence 60 years ago. Most of those ethnic groups are Buddhist. Some are Christian. Most are Buddhist. Been terrible war against those, and now there's this issue that Chris mentioned, which is the issue of the Rohingya Muslims, who were originally Bangladeshi Muslims living a long time in Burma and being harassed by this religious group, 969. The number comes from various virtues within the three categories, and doing terrible things in the name of religion, in the name of nationalism. So this is one country that we can continue to worry about at what they're doing. And I'll talk a little while later about the work that I've done there. Sri Lanka has been in civil war. The recent civil war began in 1983, but according to Chris, it began 2,000 years ago. That's a long war. It's a war for Buddhist domination, Sinhalese Buddhist domination. The Tamils from India have been there for a very, very long time. In 1983, there was a law restricting language to Sinhalese only, which knocked the Tamils out of university positions, school positions, government positions, and any kind of power in the country. And that began a 25-year civil war, which was finally won by the Sinhalese. And I just finished a project there the past couple of years, which I'll be showing you about and talking to you about. But the Sinhalese have emerged with a kind of triumphalism that is harmful to the Tamils, who are both Hindu and Christian, and to the 7% Muslim minority in the country. So it's another Buddhist country with troubles that have not yet ended. The picture on the bottom was taken this past year in Trincomalee, which is a city in northeast Sri Lanka, where we've been working on interreligious peace building that I'll talk about in a bit. This is a rather awful picture, unfortunately, but this was the Khmer Rouge. The man on the right is Mahagosananda. He is known as the Gandhi of Cambodia. He's deceased recently, and a totally remarkable human being. He was out of the country in the Khmer Rouge era, and so he survived. the monastic community was leveled out, gone, wiped out. When the war was over and most of the Cambodians were living on the Thai-Cambodia border in the refugee camps, Mahagosananda came from France where he had been studying. He spoke about 10 languages fluently. Came back to the camps and became the monk for the camps, and people revered him. He helped the people move back into Cambodia when the country was cleared out and ready for them to come back, and he trained the monastic order, brought it back from the ashes, and built it up in Cambodia. And he had all the Wats, the temples rebuilt in the city and the countryside. And every year he would organize a peace walk called the Dhamma Yatra, and I walked on that Dhamma Yatra with him and his monks. It's very powerful. They would walk to areas, these long walks, like 3 or 4 week walks, every day walking. They would walk to areas of the country that were still dominated by the Khmer Rouge, and they walked like this, open-handed, open-fisted, seeking peace, bringing people in, healing people. And the people along the way, the Cambodians are very Buddhist, very traditional. They would just come out of their houses and they would have branches with water and they would shake them on him as a kind of a sign of respect. And whatever Sangha exists in Cambodia, whatever peace is in Cambodia, he brought it there. Very important person.
I just have to add that Mahagosananda actually gave a lecture in this room a number of years ago, and Professor David Little from the Kennedy School, who also taught here, at a joint appointment, posed a question during the question answer, saying, going forward in Cambodia, now that the Khmer War is over, which of the 2 great Buddhist virtues, wisdom and compassion, which we can understand to mean education or activism, do you see as being the most critical for the country? And Gosananda, who had an impish sense of humor, didn't really answer the question except to start hopping around on 1 foot. And he was hopping around on 1 foot. And Professor Little looked completely flummoxed by this. He didn't quite get it. And finally, his student said, I think he means they're both equally important. You could only walk on 2 feet. I just had to add that.
That's very cool. This is an interesting story. He got Alzheimer's at the end of his life. He was so enlightened, you couldn't tell he had Alzheimer's. You just didn't know.
He probably had Alzheimer's when he gave that lecture.
Right. He was so brilliant, you just couldn't tell. So that's the Cambodia story, and this is Thailand. Thailand has not had very much active war on its own soil. There is fighting on the Thai-Malaysia border between Buddhists and Muslims, but it's not a huge or terribly hot conflict, but it is an issue. These are Burmese, because when the Burmese military began to crack down, there was a big crackdown in 1988, which was when I first got involved with Burma. And the Burmese tried to flee into Thailand, and they were fenced out. The Thais and Burmese have historical enmity going back centuries, and the Thais didn't want them. So the Burmese couldn't go back into Rangoon because they would have been killed there, and they couldn't cross the river to get into Thailand. They were caught in the jungle, which is where I first met up with them. And this is Sulak Sivaraksa, who's another very eminent Buddhist, also called the Gandhi of Thailand, and he started an organization called the International Network of Engaged Buddhists that I've been very involved with for a long time, which I'll show you in another slide in a minute. And he's been arrested for lèse majesté, which is insulting the king, which is an arrestable crime in Thailand, which still has a kingdom. And he has been arrested several times and put in jail. He's probably Thailand's leading intellectual. He's now about 80 and still speaking and lecturing worldwide, written a lot of wonderful books, Buddhism books about engaged Buddhism.
And we celebrated his 70th birthday in this room.
It's a busy room, Chris.
This is a great room.
And Nepal. I've been working in Nepal, like I've been working in Sri Lanka since the early 1990s, and I'm leaving for Nepal a week from tomorrow, the day after Thanksgiving. Will be my next trip there. On the right is a recent project in Lumbini. You all probably know Lumbini is the birthplace of the Buddha. It's in southern Thailand. And I met a wonderful monk named Venerable Vivekananda with a very strange background. He was born of German parents in Kilimanjaro, Tanzania. where his parents ran a hotel. Pretty unusual for a Buddhist monk. When he was a young man coming of age, he did his pilgrimage and wandering years in Asia, as many young people do, and he went to Burma and studied with U Pandita, Venerable U Pandita, a very, very famous and highly regarded Burmese Vipassana teacher, ordained, took robes, and now lives in Lumbini, where he runs a monastery. And he found out about my work with Engaged Buddhism, and since I was going to Nepal every year for other work, he asked if I would come to Lumbini and help them deal with the cultural preservation of Lumbini, the holy birthplace of the Buddha, because it's being overrun by Indian factories. It's just on the Indian border, and the Indians are building factories to get cheap Nepali labor, and the whole holy environment he feels is being destroyed. So I worked with monks and lay people. The chap in the white shirt is an anthropologist from Nepal. Worked with monks and lay people there and nuns over the years, and there have been petitions and drives, and it's a UNESCO protected site now. So we've been doing some very interesting work there, and that's been a real pleasure for me to work in that region. The Nepalese had a 25-year civil war, a 10-year civil war, 1996 to 2006. Started again because of oppression, because of this business of separation. The people on the plains in southern Nepal and the people in the mountains are indigenous people. They were not given their rights. Everything was Kathmandu-centric. The city benefited. The city was mostly Hindu, and the outlying areas were mostly Buddhist, interestingly enough. When I first started to work there, I was working on cultural preservation of the villages of the Buddhism, and people would tell me that they were told that their village was Hindu, but then they'd be plowing, and they'd plow up a Buddhist relic. Oh, they said, we must have been a Buddhist village. But when the Rana kings came in, they tried to Hinduize the whole country. This is very interesting history there. So we worked with women, and we worked with the cultural preservation issue. And in 1996, the Maoist War began. They named themselves the Nepali Maoists because it was a people's war starting in the countryside, as Mao had done in China. And it was an uprising of the marginalized people from outside the city areas. And it was a very nasty 10-year civil war. The government finally defeated the Maoists, and they're having elections this week, actually. They've had elections every year since 2006. They can't seem to settle on a government, because the country is so deeply divided. But it's another one of those ongoing wars that we have to be watching out for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the peace building I do in Buddhist lands, and then the Buddhist influence peace building, how I use Buddhism in the lands that are not Buddhist. And I'm going to start with this International Network of Engaged Buddhists. This is their 2013 conference in Malaysia. I was not there, but I have gone there in many years. This is an attempt to bring together Buddhists from throughout the Buddhist world to do training for monks, because we are concerned that the monastic community is not very socially engaged in rebuilding their communities and in trying to create structures of justice and in understanding the need to embrace non-Buddhists or different kinds of Buddhists within and beyond their country. And so we have been doing a lot of training of monks over the years. I've trained a lot of monks from Burma, from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, Nepal, Thailand, Cambodia, etc., much of the South and Southeast Asian Buddhist world. And this organization still continues and does wonderful work. A lot of the very interesting work also has been with nuns, because the nuns are given both in the Tibetan Buddhist world and the Vipassana world, they're given many fewer rights, much less privilege, much less education, much less recognition. And part of our work has been to pull up the nuns. There's now an organization called Sakyadita, which means Daughters of the Buddha, with a friend of mine who's a Western woman ordained as a Tibetan Buddhist. And she's been working with this organization to try to uplift the quality of life for women. I worked in Ladakh one summer with one of the monks there. That's the very northern India. It's a Tibetan community in North India. And we spent the summer going to the nunneries, and the women were virtually virtually household helpers, almost slaves in these communities with no rights and no education. And we've been writing about that to try to get some justice for them also. So that's an important organization. And these are monk boys. This is 1989. This is when I first went. Sulak Sivaraksa, this person from Thailand, when I finished my time at the conference at INAB, he said, go to the Burma border. There had been a big uprising in 1988, August 8th, 1988. And many of the Burmese had to flee and were living in the jungle being taken care of by the Karen ethnic group there. And of course, these boys are now men. I hope some of them are still alive. And they were trying to do monastic education. And I was on the board of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship in those days, which is a U.S. organization. We were trying to raise money to keep these monasteries going and to be able to train a generation of monks who were not subject to government influence. So that was very early work for me in Engaged Buddhism. And this is Sri Lanka. The picture on the right is a nun lighting a lamp, which they light every day when they start their ceremonies. And on the bottom left, you can see a couple of monks talking to one of the non-Buddhists. And on the top is just an exercise that people were doing. The work that we had a grant from U.S. Aid for the past couple of years through Karuna Center to do interreligious peace building with people in the northeast of Sri Lanka who are Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, and Hindu. They live, it's very rural, but the villages are separate, and they don't interface, and they don't know anything about each other. And each one blames the other for the 25 years of civil war. And they speak different languages. There's both Sinhalese and there's Tamil, and there's not much interface over who speaks what. We brought them together with translators 4 times a year for the past 2 years. So many visits back and forth, myself and my colleagues, trying to help them find common ground. And they were wonderful. There was a lot of fear in the beginning and a lot of dancing around and hesitation, but they really broke through, and they are doing all kinds of joint projects together. We had funding for them to do environmental clubs and computer education and language training and vocational training. And they now invite each other to their celebrations, their religious festivals. So they've come a very long way, and it's really settling the area nicely. What we don't have the reach to do is to change the political structures. We don't have the reach to reach out to the head of the government, to the prime minister, to help him understand the need to include the Tamils and the Muslims in order to have peace. That as long as they're excluded, there's going to be violence. But hopefully other people are working on that. Yes.
Yeah. 2 years ago, there was a conference in Bangkok of Buddhist leaders that was partly sponsored by the UN, and there's a large UN complex in Bangkok where international meetings take place. And the president of Sri Lanka, Rajapaksa, was there. And although this was heavily supported by the Thai government, and having all these scholars and monks there was, in a way, the Thai government saying that Thailand, and Bangkok, is really the heart of world Buddhism. We should think of Thailand as the heart of world Buddhism. He got up and said, no. He didn't say no. He simply presented his position as if the president of Thailand had not spoken at all. He said, as we all know, for 2,500 years, Sri Lanka has been the place, the beacon of peace and peace building for the world. And that please come to Sri Lanka because you'll see how much we've done to emphasize peace and love in the Buddhist tradition. And many people in the audience were looking at each other and just rolling their eyes. It was quite a blatant presentation, though, given that the war had only recently ended through really ethnic cleansing in the north.
Much of the work that I did in Sri Lanka was peace-building training seminars. When we make these commitments to a country, as I said, we tend to go many times over several years, And we worked with the same group of 25 people for several years, working with them several times a year, 5-day seminars. And they're now running organizations, and some have gotten university positions to teach. It seems really important that this work be handed over as much as possible to the local people to do. So when I go back there to visit, I have a whole cadre of people who are now in this field and promoting peace building. So it's been gratifying to see all the people who were there, but again, there's an enormous, enormous gulf in what has to be done in a country like Sri Lanka, especially when the president is so unconscious. Chris mentioned the Nippon-zen Mihoji Buddhists who have a peace pagoda around the corner from me, which I'll show you in a few minutes. This is another one of their order. Their order comes from Japan, and they also built a Shanti Stupa in Lumbini. The woman on the right is a Vietnamese nun living in Lumbini. There are people there from all the Buddhist orders. All the orders have built temples, who was involved in our seminars in cultural preservation for Lumbini. And the women on the left are Maoist women and government women, as they were called, people on the government side or the Maoist side in the Civil War in a remote mountain area where we were working with them on intergroup relations, helping them to understand that they were all victims as women and that they have a lot in common in terms of building a future together. All their basic needs have to be met. And this is also a couple of photos from the recent training in Sri Lanka. The person in the saffron robe is a woman, Buddhist woman, and she's sitting next to a Muslim man, and there's also a Hindu there. So they're working really hard. And when I founded Karuna Center, it was founded in the era of both the Bosnian and the Rwandan genocides. 1994 was the Rwandan genocide, and the Bosnian was 1992 to 95. So it was right in the middle of that, and we really saw our mission as addressing the growing challenge of ethnic, religious, and political conflict, and encouraging nonviolent methods of conflict transformation and building peace. And that organization is going now for almost 20 years. I stepped down last year, but the organization keeps going. And this is my other hat, as it will. This is my academic hat. I'm a professor, as Chris said, at the School for International Training in Brattleboro, and through that, I started something called the CONTACT program. CONTACT's an acronym for conflict transformation across cultures. There are brochures on the table. This is a program you could all get involved in, so I want to take a few minutes and tell you about it. Our students range from age 25 to about 75, so everybody's welcome. It's a practitioner program, or a learning to be a practitioner. And I started this because of my travels. I would be in Sri Lanka, and I would say, the Bosnians have done something really interesting in peace building. And I go to Bosnia, and I say, here's what the Israelis and Palestinians are doing. And I thought, I'm not supposed to be a carrier pigeon. People should be talking to each other. These are the people in conflict. It's their issues. It's their broken hearts. They need to transmit to each other. So I got this vision of starting a program where people could find the safety to be in a private, secluded place to talk to each other about how they're building peace in their countries. And also, people want to understand what caused the conflict. They're desperate to know, how did we do this to each other? How did we get so crazy? How could this have happened in our country? They don't know. And they're desperate to find out. And how do we stop it? What happens if it starts again? What do we do? There's such an urgency about that. And I wanted them to talk to each other. So I invented this program, and it's incredible. It's now 17 years old. We bring about 60 people from about 20 to 25 different countries every year, plus Americans. They must speak English. When I work in one country, we use translators. When I'm working here, this would be the Tower of Babel. We couldn't possibly do it. So in this situation, people have to speak English. It's 3 weeks. I've got a faculty of international people, about 10 faculty who come every year and teach in it from all over the world. And it's really deep, and people really transform. It's a profound experience for people. to meet those who come from so many places of the world who have suffered as they have suffered, whose lives have been turned upside down as their lives were turned upside down. And people say, it wasn't just me, it wasn't just my country. That happened to you also, and you survived. And we talk about survivorship, and we talk about resilience. And they really want to know about reconciliation. And so I bring in a colleague who teaches with me from Rwanda, who lost 35 of his immediate family members, and wrote a gorgeous book on his own transformation process, his own journey of healing. And he teaches them that, because I haven't had that experience, but he has. And it's so rich for them. I'm now doing another one just like it in Nepal. And I'll show you a picture of that and tell you why. That's last year's Nepal group, the whole group pretty much, and that's in 2 exercises. So after 9/11, it got increasingly difficult to get Afghans and Pakistanis into this country. I can't get visas for them. It's really hard. The US government is terrified of who's going to come in. They could have 3 PhDs, it'd be professors, it doesn't matter. So I was noticing this happening, and about 6 years ago I did an experiment, and I accepted 10 Pakistani applicants. I knew I couldn't take 10 Pakistani applicants, but I accepted 10. I got 10 visa rejections. I thought, I can't stand, this is not okay. I decided, well, if I can't bring them here, I'm going there. So I started a satellite contact program. This is a 2-week program in December for Afghans and Pakistanis and all of South Asia. So this program is what they call the SARC, the South Asian Economic Region, and it's Afghan, Pakistan, Nepal, India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. Those are the 6 countries. And this year we're adding some Burmese in, because the Burmese-Bangladeshi conflict has now become also a very hot conflict. So 2 Burmese monks and 2 Burmese lay people are also coming. We've got about 55 people coming. I'm leaving a week from tomorrow to start the program. I had 75 Afghan applicants. No one's talking to the Afghans about how to put Humpty Dumpty together again. That country is so broken. And they write these gorgeous essays. I can only take 5. I don't have any money to bring 75. They have no money. So we scholarship 5 of them. But they wrote the most gorgeous essays on their desperation to understand what to do, how to stop the war, how to protect the women, how to rebuild the community. They have no idea. So people who come out of these war zones, they need to know. They need to find out what happened, how to prevent its happening again. So this program will happen next week with all of these people, and I chose Nepal because it's the only country in the region I could choose. The Indians and Pakistanis cannot go to each other's countries. No visas allowed, they're closed. It's like the Israelis and Palestinians, it's closed because they're at war with each other. I certainly can't go to Afghanistan, and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are too far away from the other countries. So, and I also have been working in Nepal for 20 years, so I know it well. So they are all about to come to Nepal. We've got about 200 applicants, maybe 250 applicants, and we've selected, I think about 55 of them will be coming. Again, those of you who were South Asian or others, you're also welcome to this one. This is in December, and the other one in Vermont is in June. This has become a very big part of my work and a very gratifying part. And here's Tibetans in exile. I was telling Rinpoche about working in Dharamsala. I've been working in Dharamsala a lot. It's where the Dalai Lama's government in exile takes place. This is an organization called the Tibetan Center for Conflict Resolution. They found me, I don't know how people find each other, I guess on the web, and they found me because they were interested in this combination of peace building and Dharma, because they want to know how to do Buddhist peace building. That's their life. Their mission is to work with Tibetans, refugees who are all over India in settlements and also in Nepal in settlements. And they travel around the 2 countries, helping the Tibetans deal with the conflicts they feel with each other, with their Indian neighbors, and with their feelings toward China, where most of their relatives still are. trapped. And so I've been training them, and I've taken now their 2 directors with me to Lumbini to give them more advanced training. And every year they send someone to our Kathmandu program. So we try to work in an interlocked way to stay connected. And they're sitting here in front of the Norbalinka, which was where the Dalai Lama headquarters was in Tibet. They've rebuilt it in Dharamsala, and on the right there's a role play. They're talking about the harassment they get from the Indians. They are in a very fragile situation there. Nehru opened India to His Holiness when he escaped from Tibet in 1959, and they're tenuously still able to stay in India, but they have to be careful. They have no place else to go. There's a terrible issue in Nepal now because the Chinese government has put a lot of pressure on Nepal not to let the Tibetans in. And so the easiest place for the Tibetans who are escaping when they're climbing over the Himalayas is to come in through Nepal. That's their entryway, and the Nepali military is pushing them back into occupied Tibet where they're going to get killed. So that's a very dangerous situation, and something that we're working very hard to deal with is the issue of helping the Tibetans to get out, to get to Dharamsala. This is another important piece of my Buddhist peace work. And this is the award that I got from the Dalai Lama, which was quite a thrill, as you can imagine. It's one of those moments, just reaching out and getting greeted by him. I got an email one day, and I thought it was a joke. This is a silly thing. You've been awarded an Unsung Hero of Compassion Award by the Dalai Lama. Right, you're right. Tell it to the judge. And I just really didn't believe it. It was very sweet because it was a secret nomination process I knew nothing about. And 50 people were invited to come to San Francisco to receive this award. He's done it 3 times, in 2005, 2009, and there's going to be another one this spring in 2014. And it's a kind of a hocus-pocus situation of how people are chosen. Many are Asian, but there are also people from North America, South America, Europe, etc. And obviously a treasured memory for me.
Is there an actual song that we can sing?
There's no song. No song. And this is what Chris talked. This is quite an amazing story. This is the Niponzin Mihoji Peace Pagoda in Leverett, Massachusetts, a tiny town of 2,000 people just north of Amherst. And these Japanese Buddhists showed up in my town. Just after I had moved there about 30 years ago, I had just bought a house. I had no furniture, so they wound up becoming my furniture. They slept on the floor every night. And they came into town wanting to build this. And what I thought this was going to be about this big, and turns out to be 100-foot tall, big, beautiful stupa. But none of us knew anything about who they were and how remarkable they were. And there was a town hall meeting when they first came into town, and the phone tree was going around. All the Buddhists were told to go to the meeting. I went to the meeting. And here's this Japanese monk, and the old Yankees are really terrified of this organization coming into town. You know, who are these little guys with their shaved heads and their orange robes? They'd never seen anything quite like it. And the old Yankees were not very hospitable. They were afraid that they would be a cult and that they would be too much traffic, and their kids would populate the schools, not understanding about celibacy. So they had a lot of problems with this. And this head monk would hear all this nasty, nasty stuff coming at him, and he would just do this. Just do this. Just do this. I was so impressed with how much equanimity he had. And I really liked them, and I shook their hands afterwards, and I said, if you need anything, I'm a neighbor, I live around the corner, and just let me know. And I went home and wrote a letter to the editor, which was not something I've ever done before or since, and I said, instead of rejecting these Buddhists, we should take them into our community so we can learn how to deal with our anger. Because this monk handled the anger of our townspeople so beautifully. End of story, years later, Kato Shoni, the head monk, I'm repeating this story to someone in his presence. He says, oh, Paula-san, I couldn't understand a word of English. All I could do was this. But he picked up the feeling, and they moved in with me, and we built this beautiful peace pagoda together, and now there's a temple there. And they are remarkable Buddhists. They're a very, very small order, and they'll probably die out because the young people were not joining. They were started at the end of World War II by Nichidatsu Fuji, who spent the 30s with Gandhi in India, and Gandhi nicknamed him Fuji Guruji. And he turned 60 on August 6, 1945. Imagine that. Your 60th birthday is your most important birthday in Japan, and that's Hiroshima Day. So he was already a monk, but he then decided to be a peace monk and to devote the rest of his life to finding peace. And he started this order, Niponzen Myohoji. And it was the 60s, and there were lots of young monks young Japanese looking for an alternative lifestyle, and they began to join. And then he sent one of the monks, Kato Shoni, to America to start the first peace pagoda here, and he came to Cambridge. And he really wanted to build his peace pagoda on the Charles River. That's what he really wanted to do. And their form of meditation is not silence, it's to beat a prayer drum, and they chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And he would walk every day. He would walk from here to Walden Pond and back every day. You all know how far that is. You live here. And he waited and waited for years. And of course, real estate on the Charles River is not exactly available for a starving Buddhist monk, And finally, someone said, "Go west, young man." So he came west to Amherst, Massachusetts, and we all took him in. And then this got built here. And they go on long walks. They believe that when they build these pagodas and they do these long walks, they purify and sanctify the land, and it's their way of working for change. Belief, that's what they do, that's their practice, and I honor their practice because they're very fierce. In 1995, they wanted to honor the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II and the dismantling of the concentration camps and the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, and so they asked me to develop a convocation at Auschwitz, and that is Sasamori Shoni, one of their monks, standing at the gates of Auschwitz. As it turned out, we didn't plan it this way, but the first night we got there was the first night of Hanukkah, because it was a December event, and so one of the rabbis who was there brought Hanukkah candles. So here's Buddhist monks and Germans and Jews and Christians and Buddhists and Muslims and people from all over the world, 200 people, standing at the gates of Auschwitz, everybody in tears, lighting Hanukkah candles. That's Bernie Glassman next to Sasamori Shoni, the Zen teacher, who has carried this on as a witness every year in Auschwitz after being with us in December 1994. It was my first big attempt at international peace building. I knew that I wanted it to be an interreligious event, and I invited every rabbi, priest, imam, and monk I could find who would pay their own way and come, because I had no budget. I was working for monks. And we had 200 people and profoundly transformative 5-day intercommunal dialogue at the gates of Auschwitz, the hardest place I ever worked in my life. But I have a great deal of respect for these monks, and this kind of launched me also in my international peace building work. So I wanted to point out that of all the teachings there are in the Dharma, for me, this is what I find the most useful as a peace builder. It makes the most sense to me as a peace builder. If we understood interdependence, if we got interdependence in our heart of hearts, we would understand that none of us can do this without everybody else. Dr. King said, none of us are free until all of us are free. Coming out of a Christian tradition, coming out of his own sense. So I really work hard. When I'm working with non-Buddhist groups, I don't talk about it as Buddhism. I will talk about this principle without using the B word. Don't need to complicate things. But just to talk about the importance of understanding interdependence. Mother Teresa said, the trouble with human beings is we draw our circles too small. I love that. So I always have my students draw circles. And I say, who's in your circle? Your family? Your closest friends? Who else can you put in your circle? Who's outside your circle? What are they doing out there? Why have you put them out there? Can you enlarge your circle? If you live in a country in the midst of violent conflict, who's left out and what are the implications of being left out? How does that relate to the next war? It's very important questions. When you leave people out, if you deprive them of their needs, they're going to push back in. And it's going to be violent. So who's outside your circle? Impermanence. Oh my goodness, people are so nationalistic. There's so much propaganda around nationalism. It's impermanent. We didn't have states, nation states, a couple of hundred years ago. We're not going to have them a couple of hundred years from now if we're even still here. The European Union is the first attempt to get rid of them, that knock down the barriers, to say no walls, more interdependence. People who are caught in violent conflict think it's never going to end. Impermanence helps me, reminds me that when I'm guiding them, holding them, teaching them, I can say, it'll change. It will change. This war will not go on forever. Look around. No war has gone on forever. They end. It'll come. Keep working. Have the faith. So understanding impermanence. Stop fighting for this nation state that's another illusion. It's going to melt. It's just a line in the sand. And what I was taught a lot in Vipassana meditation retreats was to look at the three poisons as the roots of suffering. And I told you before that my students are always looking in these programs overseas, what's the root? What causes conflict? How did we get here? And I think about greed, anger, and delusion, and it really helps me. I was writing a paper on this recently, and I looked on the thesaurus for synonyms for greed. The list was this long. Avarice, envy, jealousy, wanting mind, desire. This wanting mind phrase is a very wonderful phrase, because when I use that phrase, wanting mind, I see where I'm caught. And I try to teach the difference between want and need. A need is what we call in peace building field basic human need. And I'll show you a slide on that in a few minutes. But a want is desire. And in English, we're sloppy and we interchange those two a lot. And so we want a new pair of shoes, and we want a new sweater, and we want a new car, but we have a car and we have a sweater. So it's not really need. It's not really a need. We say, I need a new pair of shoes. I need a new sweater. It's want. It's the wanting mind, and the wanting mind can catch us all. And the anger that I look at a lot manifests in hatred. The hatred manifests in prejudice and discrimination and oppression, which is one of the major causes of conflict. There's a very interesting gentleman who wrote a book called Violence. His name is James Gilligan. He's a professor of psychiatry, and he taught at Harvard for many years. He's now at NYU. His wife is Carol Gilligan, by the way, pretty much a power couple. And I heard him talk last year, and I read his books. I use his books a lot in my teaching, and he says that in his decades of work with prison populations, he has seen that what causes most of the violence is shame and humiliation. I thought, boy, that's interesting. Shame and humiliation. He's written books. He's interviewed all kinds of prisoners, major crime prisoners. They are shamed and humiliated, and finally commit an act of aggression. And I think of all these people who call themselves Maoists in Nepal, living in their little villages, who were shamed and humiliated because they were ethnic members, or people who were shamed and humiliated because they're Muslim, or shamed and humiliated because they're black, or women, and the way in which that turns into their pushing for violence in certain cases.
Well, could you relate to the concept of honor? Because we hear about honor killings and honor.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. When I was in Bosnia, I was working with women's groups. They were at that time Muslim and Orthodox, Serb Bosniaks. And one of the Muslim women asked me if I would work with some of the men who were in a kind of a group home because they had lost an eye or a leg or an arm or something. They were being rehabilitated. And I said, Suda, they're not ready for me. They're not going to want to see me. This is not appropriate. And she begged and begged and begged and please, please, please. And I finally went. And these guys wouldn't look at me. They were so ashamed of what had happened to them. One of the things that had happened to them in the war is their women were raped in front of them. And the Bosnian War was the first time that the United Nations declared rape to be a weapon of war. And it was done on purpose to break the family, and it did break the family because the men couldn't bear it because of honor. They couldn't bear it. And in Afghanistan, I've worked in Afghanistan. It was one of the toughest places I've ever been. And you do see the men caught up in this honor code, the Pashtun men especially, caught up in this issue of honor, and their women are tied up in their honor. That's in their culture. And I've been working with women in Sudan and South Sudan. I'll actually be there again in January. It's a really tough place to work, one of the toughest in the world, like Afghanistan. And the women in South Sudan, which is a very undeveloped place, and most of the people live in very remote villages, and their lives are about taking care of their cattle. Their wealth is in their cattle. There's very little monetary exchange. And their women are tied up in their honor. And it's a very hard thing to deal with. It's a hard culture to see change. It will change because everything's changing, and the women's movement is everywhere in the world. But it's very slow in these places because this honor is so bound up. Anyway, the greed, the anger, and then the delusion, the ignorance of around our separateness. And when those things get cracked, then we begin to have a much more substantial opportunity for having some peace. I've lost track of my notes pages ago, but it probably doesn't matter. Joseph Goldstein said, greed runs very deep in our consciousness. He's a major Vipassana teacher. Greed runs very deep in our consciousness. It's very, very difficult to deal with greed and to control our greed. And the rage often results in revenge. And the revenge is the old eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. You know what Gandhi said? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth leaves everybody blind and toothless. So revenge doesn't work. But you see it, the cycles of revenge in Israel and Palestine are predictable. You can barely take the next out-breath before there'll be a return revenge. India and Pakistan, the same thing. One side does something, the other side does something. And we get stuck. In my work in peace building, I have a model on cycles of revenge and trying to help people understand how to move out of those cycles of revenge. And part of it has to do with having time for mourning, having time to grieve for what wrongs have happened in the society so that people can then go through a place of not revenging anymore, but have made some closure on the harms that have come to them. This is at the Contact program. This is a dialogue. The woman on the left is Cambodian. The chap in the white t-shirt is from Ethiopia. The chap in the red jacket behind him is from Nepal, and the other black guy on the floor is from Liberia. And the woman, and the blonde woman, is American. So it's part of Contact again, and very, very international. I want to show you a couple of models that I use with people. How are we doing on time? We're doing fine. This is a model called a tree of conflict, and it looks simple, but it's really not simple, because people have to figure out what the problem is to start out with, and to put the problem on the trunk. Is the problem the war? Is the problem the minerals? Is the problem the resources? Is the problem the identified other people? What's the problem? And then how do you look at the roots of this conflict? Let's say the problem is the genocide in Rwanda, the split between the Hutus and Tutsis that caused the genocide. What are the roots of that? And people work in groups, and they work hard on this, and they present them to the whole group, and they talk about the colonialism, how the Belgians treated the Hutus, how the Belgians treated the Tutsis, how they kept switching sides and switching allegiance, and what happened with that, and the origin of where the different peoples came from and why they were separate, and where they didn't get along, and who had money and who had power, and all the other roots. And then they write at the top the effects of that. And then one of the Rwandan women said to me a couple years ago, she said, well, and then the leaves come down and nurture the roots again, and the conflict cycles continue. It was a really beautiful insight. And so people have to identify the many roots, the woundedness. What is the woundedness? What is the misunderstanding about history? One of the Indian guys who's coming to Contact next week sent a Facebook message around to the whole group today, because they're introducing themselves on Facebook now, and he introduced himself, and he said, I'd like someone from each country to bring a history book so we can talk about how the history of the region is taught in each of the different countries. That's an outstanding project, because our history is so biased. So one of the root causes of these conflicts is how we learn history. I mean, if you're American, imagine the garbage you learned in history. The myths, the stories, the untruths you learned, how little you learned about the slaughter of the Native Americans, and about slavery, and about women, and about labor, and about U.S. intervention. And now we're coming tomorrow to the 50th anniversary of the death of Kennedy, and how little we know about that. How much we're not told. Right? So this guy wants to bring history books from the whole South Asian region. How do the Indians teach about the Pakistanis? A pack of lies, of course. Indians are good, Pakistanis are bad. Simple. I have an Israeli colleague who's working with Israelis and Palestinians to get them to learn each other's history, because their histories are completely different. And they can't cross borders, they don't know each other anymore. So that's one of the roots. So this is one of the diagrams that we use that I find really helpful. And then we use this escalation diagram. And people look at, where did your conflict start? And what's happened to it? And we ask people to identify in their particular country, where are they with the conflict? And what stage are they at? And how do you turn it around and go backwards? And de-intensify it. And it's really interesting to see, because this is how you get a sense of crisis. And again, for people to map the conflict gives them some control over the conflict. And in the Buddhist countries, we'll talk about, well, where does greed and anger come in there? Which of those things happened because there was so much greed or so much anger? And this is a map, a very interesting diagram of basic human needs that turns out to be very important for people. And so in the middle, you can see social, cultural, and material needs, basic human needs and rights. And when those needs are denied, people are caught, as you can see in the lower part, in a cycle of violence. When human needs are denied, sooner or later there will be violence. So if we keep people separate, if we keep them oppressed, if we keep on hating certain people, we keep them shamed and humiliated, we're going to wind up in cycles of violence, inevitably, in our societies. So this is really a map of conflict prevention, because if human needs are promoted, people wind up in cycles of peace and justice. There's rule of law, there's human rights, there's reconciliation, there's constitutional reform, there's restorative justice. All those measures to help to rebuild a society. And they work. So this is a very important remembrance for people. So just a few more diagrams I want to show you. We do a lot of work on identity. If we had more time, I'd have you do one of these, but it's way too late, so we're not going to. So we ask people to do an identity wheel, and they do them, they share them with somebody else, and they talk about them, and we look at the many identities that we have. And we have a phrase in peace building called cross-cutting identity, which means that I may be American, and you may be Bosnian, and you may be Sri Lankan, but we are all women. And we have things that we share and things we can build on, or we are all teachers, or we are all water engineers, or we are all former soldiers. I'm working with a group of Israelis and Palestinians now who are all former soldiers who are working together, ex-combatants. They call themselves Combatants for Peace. Fantastic organization. So we try to build cross-cutting identities. We also talk about wounded identity. So that's who you are. And you have been wounded because of your ethnicity or your race or your religion or your gender or your sexual preference or your whatever. And how do you heal that? It's a long process to heal the kind of wound that happens toward one's ethnic identity. So that's a very big piece that we do, because I'm convinced that this idea of permanence of identity, it's more the impermanent stuff. This permanence of identity keeps people separated from each other. And it keeps our circles too small and keeps other people out, causing trouble. And then our stereotypes and prejudices. And this is a cycle of socialization that I use with people, because people want to know, where do we learn to hate? How come we're taught to hate those people? And so there's a very nice cycle that I have here that shows how people get caught in repeating the dominant beliefs in their society, but how over here on this little blue circle, there's a way out. There's a way out from maintaining the prejudice that you have learned all your life, that you learn from your education, your media, your family, your neighbors, etc. You internalize it, you participate in it, then the generations go on, you teach it to your kids. And we perpetuate the stereotypes and the hatreds. And so Chris says, for 2,000 years, the Sinhalese have been doing this with the Tamils. We are better than they are. They are outside our circle. 2,000 years. And how do you get to moral development? And how do we help other people to get to that place of moral development? And this is, I think, the last image I've got. This is called the Ladder of Tolerance. And this is a rather wonderful image. I got this from some kind of, I think, religious something or other.org. I forget the website for this one. But again, when we have time, we go through these very slowly, talking about the worst possible, which is genocide, the classical definition of genocide, extermination based on identity, moving up from dehumanization to restriction to coexistence and awareness, and all the way up to celebrating differences. I was doing an exercise last summer in Contact, and we were sitting on the floor. It was a big circle of 60 people, and there was a Algerian woman sitting next to a Jewish American woman from Connecticut. She turns to her, the young Algerian woman, she's about 25, 30, she turns to her and she said, "I've been taught to hate you all my life." She said, "I can't bear to hate you anymore, I love you," and she throws herself into her arms and sobs. She broke down. She got to that place of valuing diversity, to the top of that ladder, to really cherishing the idea that we are different and celebrating. It's very, very difficult for people to get there. Thousands of years of indoctrination. I've got it, you've got it, we've all got it. I'll tell you a wonderful story, just a quick little story about that. There's a museum in Los Angeles called the Museum of Tolerance. It's a wonderful museum. And when you get to the museum, there's two doors. And one door says, "I am prejudiced." And the other door says, "I am not prejudiced." And every person who comes into that museum has to figure out which door they're going to pull. This is a true story. And you stand there and you think, "Oh, am I really prejudiced? No, I've worked on my prejudice, and I'm not really prejudiced. Maybe I am prejudiced." The secret is, if you go to the door that says, "I am not prejudiced," and you open the door,
It's a wall.
it's locked.
It's locked.
It's locked. You can't open it because we're all prejudiced. Look in your heart, it's there someplace. Tell the truth. Open this door, and this whole museum is dedicated to working on prejudice issues. It's fabulous. And remember, students remember that all the time, so please remember that. We all are prejudiced. We all have to work on it. We all have to make our circles bigger. So this is an Israeli and Palestinian group that I brought to Turkey 3 years ago, 10 Israelis and 10 Palestinians. And again, I don't talk about Buddhism. They got enough troubles with religion. They don't need Buddhism. So I don't talk about greed or anger or three poisons or any of that stuff, but it's there. And people recognize it in me. They know where I'm coming from, but I don't have to talk about it in those kind of contexts. And these are Bosnians and Macedonians. They're doing conflict mapping here. These are educators. Both these groups are school teachers working in their different countries. And these are Sudanese and Rwandan. And that woman is doing one of those trees. Only she's got a different kind of tree there. It was like a palm tree. But she's doing one of those trees of conflict that we talked about. And these are Sudanese women. The one in the middle in the blue scarf is Darfurian. And the other two are from Khartoum, Sudan. And this is the contact program last year, showing you some of the people in Vermont in this wonderful mixed group. And I want to end with a couple of quotations that are not from Buddhists to remind us that these truths are universal. And to do it felt like Harvard Div felt like a very nice way to end with a few wonderful quotes. And so here's one of our heroes who really, he's talking about interdependence, not from a Buddhist point of view. He's about as Christian as you can get, but to realize that we are members of one family bound together by interdependence. And look at this beautiful quote. As you press for justice, be sure to move with dignity and discipline using love. So again, the profoundness, the universal truths are one. And look at this one. If we can learn to hate, we can learn to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than hate. And from the Bhagavad Gita. And from the Buddha. The Dhammapada. So it's all there. Wherever we turn, whatever religion we're working in, whatever identity we hold, those truths are there. So thank you for listening. Let's take some time for questions. Thank you. I'm going to pass this mic around. Chris, would you pass
I'll
this?
carry it around, yeah.
And I have about 17 questions here, so you guys better start asking some questions, otherwise I'm just going to monopolize the Q&A session.
Now you're driving me home, Chris. You get a chance. You get 2 hours in the car.
Oh, that's true.
Until I fall asleep.
That's true. I've got so many, though. Who wants to start? Who's starting? I'm gonna ask my questions if you don't.
There we go. Thanks, Chris.
I was just curious to know how or what event was hardest for you in terms of breaking through the differences in between your background and their background?
It's a great question. Afghanistan. I couldn't bear to see the women. The Afghan women are in burqas. It's a blue nylon cloth about as heavy as a parachute, and they put it on over their heads, and it covers them from head to toe. It weighs a ton. It's really hot. They can't breathe. And in front of their face, it's mesh like that, which means they can barely see, and they get killed crossing the streets because they have no side vision. And they get skin diseases because they never have the sun on their skin. And I couldn't stop being angry. I hold a picture in my mind of driving in the car that we used to get to our work every day. And there were women sitting in the middle of the roadway, covered in these burqas, with children crawling all over them, and their little hands reaching out, begging for a little bit of money because their husbands had been killed and they're not allowed to work. And I thought, this is insane. You're not supposed to think that way when you're a peace builder. It was really hard for me. It's a really good question. I struggled. I kept watching my anger come up, and I kept saying, Paula, don't be angry. But it was so hard to know what to do with it, because it felt, to me, like such a mistreatment, such a violation of human rights. It's a great question. Never been asked that question before. Thank you.
Next.
I was wondering if there was like a certain event or catalyst that caused you to switch from just being a professor to getting into this work.
It was the wars in the 1990s. It was the war in Bosnia and Rwanda, the genocides. I felt that psychotherapy was a very useful profession, and being a professor of psychology was a wonderful thing to do. But I couldn't bear what was happening in the world, and I thought that there must be a way in which my skills can be used in service to something larger than individual change. I wanted to work in community change. So that was why. It was the suffering that propelled me. It's all about compassion. It really is all about compassion. That's what it was. That's why I named my organization Karuna Center of Compassion, because that's what I was trying to express. Please.
Back in 1960-61, I was arrested many times in the South, and I was, beaten up by Southern white Americans, and I grew to hate them.
Yep.
And I have never overcome my hatred of Southern whites, particularly back then.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to whether you think, that's a defect. How would you think about?
Well, I wouldn't judge it as a defect, but I don't think it serves you to keep hating. I mean, that's what I would say is, it's in your own interest.
But was it back then in 1961, 62, when,
Back then it was really hard.
For me to hate them, or was it not okay for me to hate them?
It's probably on a cosmic level, it's probably never good to hate anybody, but I think on a more specific level, it was very hard. In fact, I want to tell you that one of the things that got me into psychology in the first place was I began to see by the late 60s that we were causing too much separation. We were all right, and the cops were all pigs, And we yelled at the cops, and we yelled at everybody else, and we were very self-righteous. And it began to seem to me that there was something wrong with that. And it was probably after the Chicago Convention, after '68, when I really saw that the most, that I couldn't keep othering. So the hatred is othering. And in some way, I think all of us who lived through the civil rights movement and worked in the South had a lot of othering towards Southern whites. And it's hard to get over it. And I had a very interesting story today. I got an email from a Rwandan student who's just finished his PhD, and he's looking for a job. And he wrote me and said, there's an opening at University of Alabama, should I apply? You know what I told him? I would worry about you there. So I get a sense I was still carrying that. That's a hard one. Gentleman in the back had his hand up.
You spoke about a lot of stories of peace building throughout the world. One that you didn't mention that I thought of, one that is, because its culture is so familiar to us, was the Catholic and Protestant violence in Ireland. And the peace building that has happened there that I never thought would happen in my lifetime. Could you comment on that?
Yes, it's not a place that I've worked, so I don't talk about it very much, but I've been there for conferences, peace conferences, and they're doing better than most other post-conflict countries. There is still tension between the Protestants and the Catholics, but they have done a lot of this finding common ground, seeking cross-cutting identities, and finding ways to rebuild their community. They are slowly rebuilding trust, and they're slowly taking down the walls. It's not there yet. There's still fear. There's still animosity. Archbishop Tutu was there. The Dalai Lama's been there. Everyone's trying very hard to help them deal with the reconciliation that has to take place. Reconciliation's a lifetime job. It's not going to happen fast. It's very slow, painful work, because we're holding so much against people who cause so much harm. And the blame there is really both ways, two-sided blame. But I think they're a good role model for what's possible. And I think they're moving in the right direction. I don't think they'll slide all the way back. We never know. But it looks, have you been there? No. It looks like they're moving forward.
Paula, this is the last question.
How do you take the Buddhist language out of your work when you're in the non-Buddhist countries exactly?
Well, if I'm in a Buddhist country, I'll talk specifically about the 3 poisons, for example, and the antidotes to the 3 poisons, and use that frame. In a non-Buddhist setting, I will talk about the difficulty of hatred, but I won't call it the 3 Buddhist poisons. So it's just a matter of language. It's just a matter of being respectful that religion has caused so many divisions, and I don't need to bring in kind of what people might think is a religious perspective in a non-Buddhist country. In fact, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has a new book that I just read called Beyond Religion, came out about a year ago, and he's now suggesting we have a universal ethics that goes beyond religion, which is the title of the book, because he's looking at the kind of difficulties that have arisen from the separation of religion and the belief that our ideologies keep us apart and cause us to kill each other. Please.
You were talking about the Buddhist monks and how you, and nuns perhaps, and how you give workshops to get them to become more socially engaged.
Yeah.
What do you tell them, and how do you connect it to Buddhism?
By using all the things that I just talked about, by talking about this, by talking about this saying from the Dhammapada, that the hatred they feel toward non-Buddhists is not going to bring them peace. There's no peace through war.
But do they say, well, we do know Buddhism.
Yes, and I don't attempt to teach them Buddhism, believe me, but I attempt to help them see the peace value, the peace values, the peace premises in the Buddhism, to help them use it for being real leaders in their communities, because the monks are so respected in most of Asia. It really matters to people that the monks teach them. And if the monks can really reach up and use their leadership capacities to guide their people away from hatred, it's a real service to them. Yes. I know we have to stop. We'll keep taking one more. Olivia, go ahead.
I just want to say, Paula, I'm an old friend of Paula's and have watched this work evolve, that I want to take your voice and have it spread vastly around this whole planet. You need to be heard by millions of people. I haven't heard your message for a couple of years, but I just want to say thank you, because it's such an inspiration. And I think each of us here have been so privileged to listen. And I just want to know, how might you keep carrying this work out and out and out? That's a very difficult question, but it comes from the heart and out of appreciation for this brilliant work you have been doing for these 20-odd years.
Thank you. How do I take it out? Any way I can. Whoever invites me, I speak, because I'm a little wind-up doll. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you. There was one more question here, and then we'll stop.
Some of the big problems this country has
Yeah.
in terms of, for instance, the growing
We got all the big problems here.
So how would you apply, what are the policies, like, I don't know, it's a very difficult question, but that you would propose, like, that come to the top of, right away to the top of your mind, that you would do to enhance peace in this country today?
Oh, that would take me until tomorrow to tell you. But I think everybody knows what the problems are here. That military budget is one big problem here. The fact that we're number 99 and not in the top 10 on the Global Peace Index is another problem. We have so much militarism here that we don't need it. That would be a good place to end the militarism.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula.